Good evening, everybody. This is Patrick from the Poison Pen Bookstore in Scottsdale, Arizona. And sorry for the fashionably late start tonight. I had a little technical issue, but it is a real treat and an honor to have two of our very favorite writers with us. Dan Fesperman is here to discuss his brand new book, Winter Work. And Dan, as always, was kind enough to sign a bunch of books for us. And I will put a link in the comments field should you like to purchase one. And joining him this evening is our friend Joseph Kanon, which is an inspired pairing, Barbara. So if you have questions for Dan or Joe, go ahead and put them in the comments field as they occur to you. And Barbara will bring me back on screen towards the end of the hour. So Barbara, over to you.
Thank you very much. Good evening, gentlemen. What a pleasure to have you together. And apparently this is your first conversation. Is that right?
Ever, yeah.
Yes, and it's a pleasure to be here, especially with Joe. So,
well, you obviously have read each other's works and admire them. So, just a few words about Dan. We've been lucky enough to do every one of Dan's books with him, often here and occasionally, like today, on Zoom. And that all began with his very first book, which was called Lie in the Dark. Wow, that was a long time ago.
23 years.
And in fact, Dan has won a number of wonderful honors: the John Creasy Memorial Dagger Award for Best First Novel for Lie in the Dark, the Ian Fleming Steel Dagger for Best Thriller, and the Hammett Prize, which is a wonderful international prize that's awarded by judges. What'd you win that Ian Fleming one for? I can't remember.
That was for The Small Boat of Great Sorrows, I believe.
Right, I think so,
Yes.
which is a fabulous book. Wow.
Yeah. Yeah.
So Joseph Kanon, another one of my very favorite authors and people, who we have been with him from his very beginning, Los Alamos, which won the Edgar Award. And he has visited scenes all around the world, some places which I love, like Istanbul. And today, both of them are going to be talking about East Berlin. And so in some senses, well, actually, in actuality, this is historical fiction, but not entirely so. And fascinating to see what the fallout of the collapse of the wall or the collapse of East Germany, what it turned out to be. Because it was a sort of, if I remember right, wasn't it kind of an unexpected event, Joe?
Yes, very much so. It would be stretching it to say it happened by accident, but it simply happened because of negligence. Somebody let a travel allowance. The border was open at Hungary, and all of a sudden people started pouring through. Nobody had the wherewithal to stop them, and the flood grew, and the next thing you know, people were pouring over the wall, coming through the wall, and it became a fait accompli. What happens in Dan's book, which I'm sure we're going to talk about in some detail, is that we enter then a real topsy-turvy world. I mean, we in the West see this just as a victorious evening and almost like a football match, which goes in our favor, and somebody waves a flag at the wall and it all comes down, etc. But that wasn't the experience of the East Germans. There could have been a lot of elated people and a lot of people who discovered that they were no longer in a repressive society. But there were also the people that had been maintaining that society, who in fact were the functionaries, the bureaucrats, the people that, the glue that keeps everything together. And I think this, by the way, congratulations on this book. I think it's one of your best. And I was, of course, fascinated by the Berlin aspect, but it has other pleasures as well, like page-turning pleasures that have nothing to do with an interest in.
Thank you.
Just a good book. But the part that does interest me a lot, which I would love you to talk in some detail about, is the ordinariness of, I mean, we begin with sympathetic characters who are working for the Stasi, which I think is unusual in any book, particularly in this genre. And all of a sudden we realize that these perfectly ordinary lives, which have been lived in service to maybe a half believed in ideal, maybe a not at all believed in ideal, but just they were getting by, they were getting through it. I mean, the wall went up in 61. We're talking about decades of people living this way. And all of a sudden, the rug is pulled out from underneath them. The society itself is in a state of topsy-turvy and collapse. And the least likely, or people you would least likely suspect of being devious, treasonous, or in any way duplicitous during this period come out of the woodwork like rats. This is a fascinating angle on it. I think it wasn't just the team sports celebratory evening that we see on the news. There were a lot of misgivings, a lot of fear about the future. But I'm rattling on, and you're the one who wrote the book. So let's talk about that for just a bit. Say more about like the variety of response that East Germans had to this, I mean, really world-shaking event for them. I just should add as another prelude that for all of us who lived through the Cold War, one of the really surprising things about this event is that none of us expected it to happen. Yeah. There was a sense of permanency about the division of Germany, and a permanency of just this unending conflict that seemed never to resolve itself, except it was just going to drift into some cultural collision. But nobody expected this. And then all of a sudden, there they were in the streets. And that's how the book begins. So let's start with winter work.
Yes, and I think some of the reason for that permanence was because of the wall itself, because in 1961, it began as a rapidly thrown up barbed wire here, maybe some cinder blocks there. And over the years, they had augmented it with a death zone, watchtowers, more and more layers of security. It had become tougher and tougher to escape, to get out. And I think because of that, it gave both sides the illusion, the East Germans as well, that this was an object of permanence that made the regime seem like it was going to be permanent. And like you said, one of the key events in the fall was that a newscaster went on East German television and with a very scantily vetted remark from the government, basically said, the wall's open tonight. And East Germans heard it, and by the thousands and tens of thousands went rushing down there to see if it was true. And the guards who weren't alerted to this, they had heard what was on television too. So they said, well, I guess it must be true. And they kind of threw the thing open, and there was no stopping it after that. But the confusion for people like Emil Grimm, who was the main character in this book, and he's in the Stasi's foreign intelligence branch, is that there were right away, there were a lot of rumblings about, we're going to prosecute these people. And in the sense of Erich Mielke, who was the head of the Stasi, and it was very repressive on its own population with something like 16, 17 million informants in the population, I think that was very understandable and even expected. And a lot of the East German population kind of thought, yes, let's bring these people to justice. But in terms of the Foreign Intelligence Wing, including Marcus Wolf, a very famous spy who thoroughly penetrated West Germany, you get the sense in his memoirs and in interviews he gave, and this is also the case with Emil to a lesser extent, that they sort of held themselves apart from that domestic repression. In a sense, they were even ashamed of it and favored reforms and tried to hold themselves to the side and say, oh, we weren't a party to that. We were doing the good work against our enemies abroad. We were keeping our hands clean. When I think that with people like Emil and others, they knew that they were nonetheless still a part of that awful machinery. And so he's sort of confronting this. The wall has been down. He's locked out of his office. His last paycheck is coming in 2 weeks. He really doesn't know what's going to happen or if he might even be prosecuted. His wife has ALS and is bedridden. And so he has sort of retreated to his dacha up in the woods north of Berlin. And he really is mystified by what's ahead. And he knows that the Americans want to talk to him because they were out there looking for all of these buried secrets that were suddenly up for grabs.
Right. Very much so. You know, I find that questions that I dislike when I'm asked them are the very questions that I ask when I'm asking questions.
Go right ahead.
One of those that always comes up is, how much of this is true? And it's just a question I always dread because we get into that business of what is fiction and how are things sourced and inspired, etc. But let me begin with a tiny example of something I would love to know. Look, there's a lovely detail about the deserted offices on Normannenstrasse, which was the Stasi headquarters, and which, by the way, we can all go and see today. It's now and you can see Milke's office, and there's the phone, and it's all very early 60s and atmospheric and great. But you offered a detail that I've never seen anywhere else, which is that in the chaos that followed, and people just left their offices, they weren't even getting their personal effects, so things were just left behind. so that who knew when they might be back, but why should the plants die, even if they were out of a job, etc. Is that true?
That is true. I have a reference to this. It comes up in a conversation with another Stasi officer who's very irritated by the whole thing because the people who were going around watering the plants on people's desks that the employees couldn't return to were members of something called the Citizens Committee. They were these reformers, and they were thrilled to see the Stasi shut down. So this other fellow, Dieter Kraus, is very irate that they're actually in there watering his plants and things like that when they've run him out of the building. But yeah, there were lots of little interesting details about the dynamics of the time. And on the CIA side as well, there's a lot in this book that actually happened. Some of the most ludicrous events in the book were things that actually happened, and you wouldn't expect an agency on the level of the CIA to be doing those types of things, but they did.
Well, we get back to that first point, which is that it caught everyone by surprise.
Yeah.
I mean, CIA had no real plan for dealing with this because nobody anticipated that it could happen. And on the other side, we have, this upside down world now, people not quite sure what it's going to mean. And there's also this general sense, certainly it comes through in the book, and I think it was true in real life, of things just tired, that this was a regime that was collapsing in and of itself because it had just worn itself out. It was so sclerotic and so cynical, and people they were just tired of dealing with it. So that there was this sense of a building that had just been creaking, and finally just went boom and fell to the ground. And all of a sudden people go, oh my God, now what do we do?
Yeah, all of the slogans that they'd been giving people to live off of for the previous 45 years or so, in the previous 10 to 15, they all were ringing hollow, progressively more hollow every day. And even the civil servants such as Emil knew that. And he knew that he was in a position of privilege. He would shop in the special party stores for the high officials where he could get things that most of his neighbors couldn't. They were quite aware of the hypocrisy of the whole system and how top heavy it had become, and how it just couldn't meet its promises anymore.
I think that one of the useful things about this book as a corrective is that most Americans, even those interested in the period, don't have that real sense of how it changed over the years. I mean, in the last book I did called The Berlin Exchange, it's set at the height of the Cold War, it's 1962, 63. And I wanted a period where it was still remotely possible that some people at least still half believed in what was going on in East Germany and thought that it was a cause, and it was, that communism itself was an ideology that deserved some of their respect and some of their loyalty, etc. That was not true of anybody by 1989 when your story happens. I mean, there had just been this arc of disappointment, and it's like the air went out of the balloon. But it takes a long time for that sag to happen, and then all of a sudden it's gone.
Yeah. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, by all means.
And I love the way your book illustrates that the lingering idealism, which was, as you said, still quite strong among a lot of people at that time, including people who were coming in to visit or people from other countries who were eyeing this, hopefully, as an experiment that they hoped would succeed. But as you said, by 89, it was all so tired and empty that's why it collapsed so quickly, because there was this upheaval of people. There's another scene mentioned in the book that was from real life. It was when Marcus Wolf, the spy master, he fancied that since he had favored reform, that he could go down to this massive demonstration at Alexanderplatz that occurred about 4 or 5 nights before the wall came down. Hundreds of thousands of East Germans showed up because they knew, now we're not being punished for this. We can actually show dissent. And he decided to give a speech in which he thought, I'm going to be the bridge between these leaders who have lost touch and these people who have so much disdain for the leaders. I will show them the way to reconnect. And he got up there, he started reading from his notes, and people began whistling, which in Europe is the way they boo, and hooting at him 30 seconds into his remarks, and he was visibly shaken. You could kind of see his hand quivering a little with his remarks. I think I think it hit him and many people who were watching then. That's when it hit them. This is inevitable. There is nothing that will stop this now, because if this crowd will hoot at this revered super spy representative of the government, they will hoot and overthrow anyone at this point. So.
And such a wonderful context for that, I think, a literary riff in the bargains we make with ourselves and the kind of stories we tell about ourselves. I mean, you think of the people who were committed communists in 1946, 1948, and now it's we're that many years later. And what are the bargains that they make with themselves about why they supported it in the first place, or why they continue to support it when it might have been possible to change? I mean, after all, it's not possible. You know, writers like Christa Wolf and highly regarded people, the intelligentsia, all of whom lived in what is now a fashionable part of East Berlin.
Yeah.
But Marcus Wolf is the classic example of this. I mean, I don't know how many people listening to us have actually read his memoirs. It was a bestseller at the time, and certainly a famous Cold War memoir.
Yeah.
But like all such spy memoirs, I find just wonderfully self-serving. I mean, part of the joy of reading this book is to see I feel like one of those people whistling in Alexanderplatz going, what are you talking about? You know, you're the one who helped. You built the prison walls.
Yeah.
And saying that it was just dumb people that were holding them together, but we who were enlightened realized that we had to go along to get along, but we were really not like that. We were bad, but we weren't like the others. And
yes.
Really, Marcus Wolf, who's one of the prototypes for Carla? I don't think so. You know, it's like that. Can we switch horses just for a minute? Because I had a sort of writerly question. Anyone who's familiar with your work and who's a fan, and certainly if they're familiar with Safe Houses, will realize that some characters from Safe Houses have been brought back in winter work. To my great delight, I must say, it was wonderful to spend time with them. But I was curious as to what that's like from the writer's process point of view. I've never done this. I've never brought back a character, or much less had a serial character. And I wanted to know, from you, is it easy? Is it difficult? I mean, do you feel that it's the same person you knew in the other book? Or do we have to give them a kind of growing dynamic to keep it interesting for you? And the readers are always pleased, I think, to see a character back. But how is it for the writer?
Well, it's interesting because I'd done it in my first two books, mostly because my publisher said, do you have another book with this character? And I said, well, I don't, but I could write one, because my inclination was to not repeat characters. I tended to start fresh with every one. But when I wrote Safe Houses, Claire was sort of more of a sidekick character. She was not the main character. And I had so much fun writing her. I enjoyed her company on the page. And so I decided with the next book that I would use her again. And this was a book, I mean, Safe Houses was set in, I think, 85 and 2014 in two different periods. She's briefly in the latter period. And the next book was in 1999, a couple of years before 9/11. And this book is in 1990. So it's not like I'm very good at thinking these things out, because if you would think of it as a series with her, you would have parts 1 and 4, part 3, and now part 2. So I'm not very good at figuring these things out in advance. But it kind of occurred to me naturally. I did not go into with this plan of, oh, I like Claire, I'm going to use her in book after book. It's just, I enjoyed writing her as the main character in the second of those books. And then in this book, I decided I wanted to make her one of the main American character, but that Emil, the East German character, would sort of overshadow her a bit. So it made it easier in the sense that I didn't have to think it through as much when I was creating her. But I did feel an obligation to fully flesh her out for anyone who wouldn't have read any of the previous books. But I also felt this inclination to give people rewards who had read those two, and have some references to past relationships in the other books, kind of catch you up on where those stood, very briefly, but enough to give people a bit of a reward who liked her and recognized her moving forward. But it's tricky, because I realized that by having written this book after the one that came later, but referred to something obliquely, you never would have known, that happened in this book, I had to be very careful about what I said then, because that was locking me into something that would happen in this book. So
Well, there's an additional technical problem, which is that if she has survived,
Yeah.
if she's not going to be killed in some other episode, but that's a minor point. We don't want to spoil any of the plot turning things. But is it Bochum? Is that how you pronounce Bochum's name?
Bauckham, yeah,
Yeah.
Clark Bauckham, yes.
Anyway, he also has another appearance in this book, but there I see a much more utilitarian. I mean, he's
Yeah.
a wonderful device to convey the CIA life, so to speak, and what
Yes.
people were saying at the time, and it allows you not to be didactic and to get a lot of information across. So I can see the usefulness of him. With Claire, there's a very interesting thing where she grows. You're going to create a character arc that goes back in time as well as ahead of time. And I thought,
Yeah.
this is technically very interesting. I was fascinated by that aspect of the book. Not that I want to get derailed on that. We can go back.
No. But I'm glad you mentioned Clark Bauckham, because I had so much fun with him, because as you said, he's in this book, he has recently retired, and Claire uses him sort of for institutional history in Berlin. She mines his knowledge, but it also gave me a great opportunity for him to spout off about how many different times in the past we've made deals with people in Berlin. Coming out of the post-war, when he was first starting, we made deals with all of those Nazis and SS people, whether they were rocket scientists or Reinhard Gehlen, who was running their intelligence service and had been in intelligence for the Wehrmacht on the Eastern Front. So, and I think he sees us looking for these secrets with these East German Stasi people and thinks, here we go again, making deal with all these creeps. And I guess I'm on board with it, but it really starts to bother him, and he sees history repeating itself in a way. And so it, as you said, it was utilitarian. It's nice to have him around sort of as this institutional voice of the history of that region for the CIA.
Plus, if you ever need a really good brandy off Savigny plots, he's the guy
Yes.
where to get it. Right.
Exactly.
Talk about Berlin for a minute. You were a correspondent there?
I was there for 3 years from 93 to 96. So things were still very fresh and were changing incredibly rapidly. That was the period in which the Stasi began to open up its files with Joachim Gauck, I believe it was, led this commission to let people come in and read what the Stasi had collected on them. It was when they first opened the headquarters, and you could go up, and before there was even a museum, you could go up and see Erich Mielke's death mask and his office and all of that. And it was also a time when all of the neighborhoods were changing. A lot of the East German neighborhoods were still very run down and pockmarked with scarring from the war still. And I had my office, my first year there, I had my office over in Scheunenviertel near the Neue Synagogue, and with 5 other journalists. And it was so cheap that it was in a Hinterhouse, and we had to help shovel coal once a month in the winter into the basement. They would arrive and they would dump it in the courtyard. So I got a real taste for living in that part of Berlin that was changing so fast and seeing it change. And I had a lot of fun setting some scenes in some of those neighborhoods that I saw changing at that time. So it was a big help to me in sort of recreating the atmosphere of that period.
Could I ask a question, Joe? Which is, it was, it's the fact that there was never enough money. Because you've mentioned that they weren't even able to, repair much of the war damage. And based on my time in Romania, which is admittedly short, where again, there just wasn't enough money, and they tried to create like faux factories to give an impression that people were really working, but the factories didn't even make anything. And there's a movie you can see in the museum in Budapest. You reminded me when you were talking just a little while ago, with the incredulity with which the Ceausescu's faced the mob. They just couldn't imagine that like that it was going to turn on them.
Yeah.
But I've often thought if they'd ever found an economic model that worked for them, do you think it would have made a difference? I mean, if you go to Vietnam, it's the most capitalist country I've been in. They figured out, some way to move forward. But many of these communist autocrats never figured that out.
Yeah, I don't, that's something we'll never know because that opportunity probably would have come up. It came up in Moscow, and you can talk about how well or poorly they've handled it with the oligarchs and whatnot. But it probably would have surfaced as things would have begun to open up after perestroika and all of that in the Soviet Union. So who knows? They may have figured out some model where they were combining capitalism, but it just, as you said, a good indicator of how bad off things were. We think of the Germans as being masters of technology and engineering, and with good reason. But in East Germany, the only real espionage they were interested in the United States, as opposed to, say, NATO, was to steal technological secrets, was industrial espionage, corporate espionage, to try to get tech secrets and whatnot so they could copy their computers. And they weren't doing a very good job of that. So I think that gives you a feel for how their sort of technology infrastructure was suffering because of the economy they had.
There's a really interesting TV series called The Fox. Have either of you run across it on MHC TV?
No, I've not seen it.
Well, it features a woman, Anna, who's a former Stasi spy, and she and her Muslim friend, I can't remember his name. Anyway, they are doing basically sort of private eye work in, a reunited Germany, but her past in the Stasi keeps coming up to grab her.
Yeah.
In the relationship she has with other people who were also Stasi spies who are kind of dispersed around is often extremely difficult. It's the only thing I've ever seen along those lines, but if you both are interested, you should try to catch it. I think it's only 2 seasons, but it's very well
I'll
done.
look for it. Yeah.
The Fox.
Okay.
Anyway, back to you, Joe.
This business about the money in Germany, I mean, people forget the history of this. For a long time, West Berlin was as poor as East Berlin. And,
Yeah.
The immediate post-war years were hard on everybody. They were especially hard on the East because the Russians were just ruthless about taking, they would literally dismantle a factory and put it on a train and send it off to Lutsk and hope for the best. So that we got this country that was economically raped, physically destroyed, was now being run by a system. Often people will say to me, why did in the days when you could just cross the street and go to live in West Berlin, why didn't people do that? And I said, because it all looked the same. And if you had a ration card where you were living, that's where you stayed. It was the way to get milk for your kid. Later, when things changed and the Kurfürstendamm becomes this great glittery symbol of capitalism, and poor old East Berlin is looking dingier and dingier and dingier. I think at one point you described it as mushroom color, which I thought was a perfect description of a lot of the apartment buildings where they just look like dirty mushrooms.
Yeah.
But there's a real irony in all of this too, because they were so short of funds, and particularly short of any kind of foreign currency which they needed to bolster the economy. They didn't redevelop the Mitte. They didn't redevelop the historical center of Berlin, which now, of course, is a huge tourist attraction, but only by virtue of not having been destroyed in the first place. They did dynamite the palace, the Hohenzollern Palace, and would have probably dynamited all the rest if they had had any idea of what to put up instead. What they wanted was what was going up in West Berlin, and it became that kind of mine is prettier than yours kind of, contest that they were having. And consequently, all of the redevelopment effort was shoved toward Alexanderplatz. This was going to be the great new symbol of the socialist East. They weren't going to reproduce the Hohenzollern Center. And what it ends up looking like is Zoo Station in the West. And so what you really have are these two bookends of, I think of them as late 1950s or 1960s modernism. It's almost like going to, an American city that would have thrived at that time, Dallas, Minneapolis, and it could be anybody.
Yeah.
It was only because they were so short of funds that so many of the historical buildings were saved to be repaired later and to be restored. The Berlin we now see. Dan, when you were talking about being there, that was the early 90s when I first went as well. And I remember vividly the change. I had not known it pre-law. I mean, I had not known the wall. I only knew after 89. And one of the things I remember the first day I was there was being on the S-Bahn, an elevated train, and just passing this sea of building cranes. I had never seen anything so ambitious in my life, where they were going to move the government, they were going to unite the countries, and Germany was a rich country. They could actually afford to do this. I mean, there are very few European countries that would have that kind of wherewithal. But the staggering extent of the redevelopment and or the development, not even redevelopment, and the building and the fact that everywhere you went, and because the soil is Brandenburg sandy, they're always draining. So you have these drain pipes that are actually on the surface of the city, and they were everywhere. And you could tell that they were building. I thought it was quite staggering. Now you don't see that. You'll see the odd crane, but when they were determined to put the thing together, it was a real Humpty Dumpty with a will. It was extraordinary.
Yeah, and they were doing so much building, as you said, while we were there. I think it was the world's largest building site at the time, later supplanted by Dubai when they brought in all the cranes there before the crash. But what was so fascinating about it as well is in this whole strip where the wall was, that area that had been cleared out for the death zone, and it hadn't been touched in years. And when they started digging there, they were unearthing the old Hitler bunker, the old bunker for the SS drivers. They, of course, hit a few unexploded bombs, which went off from the Second World War. So, and it was at a time when Germany was also going through all of these 50-year anniversaries of the end of World War II. And so they were just wallowing in this angst-ridden history of all the bad things and horrible things they had done in the Second World War, and kind of reliving it for a last big surge to try to get it behind them. But at the same time, they all of a sudden were confronting all of this new recent horrible history in the East. And I think a lot of West Germans saw that as an opportunity to say, see, they were just as bad as we were 50 years ago. And a lot of East Germans were using it to say, no, let's talk about you 50 years ago. It was this competing historical darknesses going on. It was a very interesting time to be there, because you felt like, and I've used this line in my books, it was like being in this 20th century historical theme park to see all of this going on and all of this rebuilding, to in some ways try to cover it up and make it disappear, in other ways try to kind of honor it and preserve at least some memory of what had happened with some new museums and things like that. So.
Yeah, I find I would like to think generously that most of it airs on the side of the second half of that.
Oh, I think so, and I think you're right. Extraordinary
how it's the monkey on the back that won't go away. I mean, the Holocaust is discussed in Germany. It's still a living, breathing topic.
Yes.
It's a meaningful one, and
yes,
one worthy of exploration, etc. I've never been anywhere that had more memorials.
Yes.
Or everything seems to get saved and memorialized. It's just extraordinary. I remember one day my wife was here, not with me in Berlin, and I was researching one of the books, and she said, "Do you have a good day?" And I said, "Oh, it was good. I went out to Sachsenhausen to see the camp, and then I was, went down to Normannenstrasse to see the Stasi headquarters. And then I was, the remand prison." And she said, "Well, I'm so glad you're having a wonderful time."
Yes.
One prison after the other. But the point is, they were all available and they were tourist items.
Well, and it's especially noticeable when you're an American and you see how often we either try to cover up or gloss over or glorify maybe some dubious history. What you will not see in Germany is, I've never seen a single one. Maybe there are a few places. You will not see memorials to the Nazi dead or to the Wehrmacht. There is no controversy, say, comparable to the Confederate statues controversy here. As you said, they will still earnestly and at length discuss the Holocaust and are eager to. And that compunction, I think, was best summed up there was a cartoon in Spiegel that ran while I was there, and it showed a bus arriving in heaven from Germany. And as people were getting off, there was a sign that had two arrows on it. And the arrow said one way, it said heaven, and the other way it said discussion of heaven. And all the Germans were going to the discussion of heaven. So it kind of sums up. They really do want to talk about it. and deal with it, as opposed to in America, especially right now, where I think there's a lot of reluctance to embrace some of the tougher parts of our history.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. Did you subsequently go back to Berlin? I mean, are you one of these people who loves Berlin? I ask as one of these people who loves Berlin.
Yeah, I've been back several times. The last time I went back so I could see Hohenschönhausen prison and go back to the Stasi headquarters and this area north of Berlin where a lot of the book is set, where Wolf had his dacha and where the party had their little, they had a lot of little houses in Waldsiedlung up there in this community for them. I wanted to see all of that. I was very lucky in that I went there in February of 2020, and within 2 weeks after I got home, all of the flights were shut down for the pandemic. So I got my last trip there was sort of by the skin of my teeth, and I really want to go back. So.
And just in time to force you to stay in your office and write instead of gallivanting.
Exactly.
It's true. Do you find the, are you tempted to use Berlin again?
That's a good question. I won't in my next book. In fact, in my next book, I'm doing something I haven't done before, which is I'm creating a fictional Eastern European country, which is definitely not East Germany. And it's in the present day. It's sort of a blend of Hungary under Orban and a couple of other countries over there. And but I didn't want to be welded to the facts because they seem to be changing so fast, for one thing. So I wanted to be malleable enough where no one could say, oh, well, then this was very different 6 months later. So, but I may, because I just loved living there so much and it got into my bones so much. I mean, you know, you've been there many times yourself, and it has that effect on you.
I always thought once would be enough, but then you're drawn back to it. Anyway, I've now said 3 novels in Berlin, and never say never, maybe there will be another one.
That's true. I actually used The Good German as a travel guide when I went to Berlin. It was, Joe. You know, we stayed at the Adler, and you know, we went out and looked at the the Brandenburg Arch, and we followed you down to Potsdam, and you know, did all the whole 9 yards. It was really. I've approached it from the river, you know, coming up, because there's a very good cruise, I think, that river cruise that you can take. But, you know, one of the things that really struck me the first time I went to Berlin, we were on a Baltic cruise and we stopped at a port, the name of which escapes me, but it's north of Berlin. But it was like a 3.5-hour bus ride to go from the port to Berlin. And there's just like miles and miles and miles of nothing. You know, sort of trees and lands, but it was, you know, sort of like a German Kansas, except instead of grain, you know, it was lots of trees and kind of whatever. I didn't realize how Germany was so sort of far away and so much emptiness around it.
And in Pomerania, in the north, if you're on the Baltic in the North Sea, you have very flat agricultural land, and it goes on and on and on, and it can look dreary. You know, on the other hand, it's cabbages and beets and everything that's part of the cuisine. So those are the fields you're looking at. They're all there. I'll tell you a story about the ship in Berlin, if I don't get in trouble. When they made the movie of The Good German, they had me look at the preliminary script, and it was one of those wonderful author moments where you realize that they hadn't used a single line from the book. But I'm going to complain. I was just so thrilled they were making it, and they turned it into magic. And they had asked if there were any historical inaccuracies, would you point them out? And so I did, and there, you know, I didn't make a big deal of it. But at the end, I said, look, you know, you have to do whatever you need to do to make the story arc work, and you know, whatever narrative demands the film has. Most people are not going to care what the centuries war, you know, and whether they could cross from one sector to another, and et cetera, et cetera. These are just matters of historical fact, but they're not necessarily germane to the story. But could I plead with you that in the end, when Lena leaves, instead of, I know that you don't want to do an airport scene because that would be resonant in Casablanca, which is what they did end up doing. But could you have her leave on a truck or bus or something, because as it is, she's sailing from Berlin, and Berlin is landlocked. And this is known by anybody in a European theater. You might be able to get away with it somewhere here, but you really need to change this. And they said, well, we've looked at the map, there's a river there. I said, oh, it's a river. You have her sailing to Amsterdam. This is physically impossible. So they went to the airport.
That's pretty amazing. They could have sailed her across the Wannsee, I guess, but that wouldn't have gotten her very far.
If you're on a river trip, they bus you up from Martin Luther's home to, to Berlin, because the water doesn't go that way. There's a wonderful thing. Scottsdale had an actual German prisoner of war camp during the war. It was down by one of the mountains where now there's the zoo and the botanical garden and so forth. But anyway, they planned a great escape. It was a bunch of German naval prisoners, and they decided that their way out was to build a boat and sail away down the Great Salt River, which of course, they were easily caught because there was no river. But I've always thought that, I wonder today, if the presence of Google would make many of those kinds of stories completely obsolete. Because, everyone has a phone. You could probably determine that the Great Salt River was not going to be was not going to float your boat. I wonder how much the Ukrainians are, the technology is making a difference. So at least, in the eras you're writing about, this technology doesn't exist, right? So it's more the old fashioned thing.
I think that's one reason. I don't know about, go ahead.
I think we were saying the same thing. It's one of the reasons I do it.
Yeah.
I just do not want to write about looking everything up on Google.
Yeah.
No, but didn't we talk, Joe? I'm trying to remember whether it was you or somebody else recently about the fact that technology has proved to be so easily penetrated now that spies are going back to the old fashioned stuff, writing notes, drops, the whole bit, stuff that can't be hacked.
It's meeting on a park bench. I mean,
Yeah.
As a classic example of this, there's a wonderful scene with Claire where we're going to have a meeting, and all that happens is, you're just watching from this angle, from that angle, is it for real? Is so-and-so not there? It's absolutely suspenseful, and it does exactly what you want it to do in the book. And it's an old Cold War trope, and I thought, boy, it worked then and it works now. This is what we want.
Yeah. Yeah, and I would be kind of intimidated writing a contemporary novel in some ways because of I sort of understand the technology, but I don't really know its limitations well. I don't know its, I will watch these television series which seem to really have it and probably overstate what you can do with it, I'm sure, as they like to do. But I watch it and I'm just kind of baffled, and I think, how would I even deal with that in a book? Because I'm much more interested in what the characters are thinking and doing and what's happening at a more personal level.
Which you do brilliantly, I might add. The lesson we've all learned is never take your phone if you're going to do something nefarious.
Yeah.
Leave your phone home and get a burner. That's the way to go. Patrick, why don't you come and join us? You're a terrific Dan Fesperman fan and Joe Kanon fan. What would you like to contribute to this?
Well, I'm just so fascinated by this whole period and the subject of this novel, Dan. Last year, I think we got off on the topic just for momentarily about the Stasi's investigative techniques, and their psychological kind of ops. The question, I guess the question I have is, Marcus Wolf, he wrote a memoir, did he not?
Yes, yeah. And Joe was talking about that earlier. It was A Man Without a Face was what it was titled in English. And as Joe said, it was very self-serving, but it was fascinating. It had a lot of glimpses, and he took great pride in his successes in penetrating the West German government.
And he, his image, as with Galen, who you mentioned earlier, who also wrote a memoir, in part, I think, to try to rehabilitate himself.
Yeah.
In public consciousness.
Yeah.
Wolf comes across as this kind of debonair sort of, thinking man's spy, probably had a cigarette on a holder, that kind of guy. But didn't he refer to Romeo agents? He was,
yes.
Did you talk about that already? Forgive me if you have already.
No, I haven't talked about that, but one of his favorite techniques, they were called the Romeos. He would take these attractive young males, give them a West German or Western European identity, slip them into Bonn or into Brussels if he wanted to infiltrate NATO. And their technique would be to befriend lonely young women who had key positions, not necessarily themselves, but maybe they were a stenographer or a secretary for someone really high up or really important. And they would, they would find these vulnerable women and romance them and worm their way into their confidence. And it was quite successful. It was sort of a male Mata Hari type of thing, except these fellows, a lot of their training involved turning them into very good, understanding people and good listeners. And it made them wildly successful. And so, yeah, he was quite good at that.
Were there Juliet agents?
There isn't a whole lot. He didn't talk about a whole lot of that. I'm sure they have the usual honey traps and all of that. If they had West German businessmen or American businessmen visiting different places and they wanted to get technological information from them, but it was more of the Romeos. And he did have some famous female agents who there was one very high up in the BND who he cultivated himself. What I was surprised by was the degree to which he would have them come back and would meet them personally in East Germany. You would have thought that would have been so incredibly risky that they never could have pulled that off. But he would have them come back into the country and he would meet them. He would cook for them in his apartment if they were real favorites of his. And I think they were so confident that the West just had nothing. The CIA got its clock cleaned in East Berlin whenever it tried to place people spying on the Stasi. We had far more success placing people in Moscow than we ever did placing people inside the Stasi or trying to infiltrate them in East Berlin. And he was well aware of that. So I guess that's how he was able to pull that off.
How was that brought off? How come we weren't very successful?
That's a good question. You'd have to ask the CIA. Maybe Joe would have some opinion.
Check the
on that.
archives. Joe, do you know?
I don't really know. I mean, I don't have any personal information about it. My guess would be the Stasi were good.
Yeah.
You know, it was a very hard society to penetrate.
Yeah.
What they were mostly involved in was penetrating West Germany.
Yeah.
And
Yes.
they were wonderfully successful because there were so many ties back and forth.
Yeah.
You know, imagine, I mean, exchanging prisoners and selling them for hard currency. I mean, it's just an extraordinary event. And they were doing this as a matter of almost public policy. One way of risking foreign currency. But the fact was that they had that many people to bargain, to play with as chips, you know, 250,000 people over the span of a year, of a few years. You know, I actually quoted Marcus Wolf on one aspect of that program. And then I realized later I had used his information. And I thought, but, you know, the source here is Marcus Wolf. So yes, it's just a question of how useful is it to use Marcus Wolf because nobody else was saying.
Yeah.
I mean,
I don't know if we were that successful in Moscow either, by the way, though.
No, we weren't.
It was considered a very, very tough nut to crack.
It was.
If you've been there, you can imagine how tough it really was. It's still tough. You know?
Yeah. And
Very-
there was, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, sir.
There was that period late in the Cold War, just before all this was happening, when Moscow rolled up all of these agents that we did have there. And it was because of Aldrich Ames basically betraying them all. But I don't think the CIA had anything comparable to that network of agents to be rolled up in East Berlin. They would be caught almost immediately. And I think one reason, since Barbara was asking, is in both places that it was so tough is when you have such a strict domestic security apparatus and so many people are willing to report on their fellow citizens, it is not an open society. One thing that made West Germany so easy to penetrate was that it was an open society. One thing that made America so easy to have spies in, and London, was that it was an open society, whereas in East Berlin and in Moscow, it was a tight ship, not just because of the Foreign Intelligence Service, but because of the domestic security and all of the informants, and everyone was constantly looking out for either some sort of threat or some sort of reason to keep their mouth shut. So that made it tough.
I have a quick question actually for both of you regarding the Stasi. You know, unless I'm misunderstanding their role, wasn't it basically to surveil their own population was the chief objective? And then I read that just last year, wasn't it, Dan or Joe, that they opened up the files, and you know, one could go and request their own Stasi file. I think this was in just summer of last year.
Oh, that was a long time ago, actually. They started opening up those files while I was living there in the mid 90s.
Oh, really?
And had this big commission, and there was a huge backlog and a waiting list of people to get in to look at it. And yes, the Stasi did all of that, but the HVA, or the Foreign Intelligence Service, was pretty separate from all that, even though the guy who ran it, was pretty separate from that, even though, and then the guy who ran everything, Eric Milke, he was an old murderer and rabble-rouser and thug himself. And he kind of ran the domestic side of things that way. It was very repressive, but they did have a pretty clear line of demarcation. The Foreign Intelligence people did not work in the same floor or anything of all those other people. But yeah, it was quite efficient, quite a lot of file keeping. I think the final figure was something like 16 to 17 million people who had at one time or another reported to the Stasi about a friend, a neighbor, a family member, a co-worker. That's why they had so much voluminous paper on everybody in the country.
And you see, it's kind of a cautionary tale about things that might be slipping back into the fabric of our own country on the fringes. Do you get concerned about that at all?
Yeah, I mean, today, every time you sign on and go to Google or social media, you're probably being monitored by one commercial interest or another. So
Right.
I worry about it. I worry more really about, I mean, information about me and Joe and you and Barbara is all over the place out there.
Right.
You know, you can be on Facebook or Twitter and you can make an inquiry about something, and 2 minutes later you see an ad for that.
That's
Something
right.
about that pop up in your feed. So that tells you all you need to know about that. But yeah, I think what's well, anyway, I'm sure Joe has something to say on that too. So.
Well, as somebody else once said, and I can't remember who now, we've given up our privacy for shopping.
Yeah.
You know, that's probably the case. So far as the Stasi and the files are concerned, you'll remember it was a key plot point in that wonderful movie, The Lives of Others. That
I was just going to mention that movie. Yeah.
Read your file and see what was said about yourself.
Yeah.
Originally, the great debate was, if we do this, if we open the files and if we open the doors, it will tear this society apart, because it was your neighbor, it was your aunt, it was your niece who was reporting, and now it will become clear. And I think it says a great deal for German society that their answer to this was better to know the truth.
Yeah.
They compiled these files. We really ought to know what they said. And just amazing. And there are still people, you know, when they were shredding a lot of the files, there are people who are painstakingly gluing them back together, which I think is, they'll never do it. It's really, but making the effort had a kind of symbolic or iconic.
And I do know people, I have met people who have purposely, they decided not to look at their file. They checked, they found out there was a file on them. And then after thinking it over, they thought, you know, I don't really want to know who those people were. I don't want to know who betrayed me, even if it's somebody in my family. Maybe it's, I'm ready to move on. I would prefer not to know. It would just wreck maybe my family, my workplace. So there have been some people who have consciously made the decision to not find out.
I have a question from one of our viewers here on YouTube. Chip, he wants to know, let's see, he says, Dan, you mentioned Claire, and it prompted me to remember other memorable female characters in your novels. As a male reader, how do you do so well and so convincingly? How do you so well and so convincingly write from a female perspective? And then as a corollary to that, he says, also, I wonder if any of your female characters are based, at least in part, on strong, resourceful, and intriguing women you have known.
Interesting. And first of all, thank you for, I'm glad he thinks that. I hope that females think that as well. It would be even more coming from them. But I think it's the way you try to model any character from their point of view, is you try to put themselves in their shoes. I try to be a good listener. I pay a lot of attention on social media to what angers women today, about what sets them off, what has angered them for years that they didn't talk about, that maybe now they talk about. So I think if you're a good listener, you can sort of put yourself into the mindset of almost anyone, no matter how noble, no matter how reprehensible. If you pay attention and just try to think like you believe that they must be thinking, you start to see the world through their eyes a little more clearly. So I guess that's true. And that's true whether you're writing about somebody from a different culture, from a different gender, from a different anything. It's just, you just have to try to think about it from their point of view and see the world that way. And it's not easy, but I think almost anyone can do it if you have some empathy and some understanding.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, I think one of the driving forces of fiction is this kind of emphatic pursuit. How does the world look through somebody else's eyes?
Yeah.
It's just about you, it's about others. I think dialogue, for instance, functions this way. The minute somebody opens his or her mouth, he or she is beginning to define the character. And it doesn't, describing them doesn't do it for me. They really have to talk. They really have to say something, which means that you, the author, or the author of the book that you're reading, is actually using different voices, is seeing things from different points of view. And I don't know that this can ever truly be successful. Who knows? It's now become a kind of third rail in discussions of fiction. But I think that some of the greatest female characters in literature were written by men.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
There's no reason that shouldn't be vice versa, and in any other kind of
right.
I don't want to trip on, because you don't want to be insensitive, but on the other hand, I really do think that we don't credit fiction enough for making the effort to do this. I think this is one of the reasons we have stories and have fiction, is to try to see the world differently. If you walk 5 feet away and you're seeing another angle, you're seeing something else. This is what books do to us. It's supposed to change you and enlighten you and make you aware of somebody else, not just yourself. And I don't think you can do that unless you make the effort and try.
And I'd like to say that a few people write dialogue better than you do. It's just such natural dialogue. It's always wonderful. You always get a feel not only for that person's station in life, but also what they do for a living. They talk like someone from that field talks. It's just so authentic, and I just love the way you do dialogue. So,
thank you.
I agree. And of course, one of the pleasures of being a reader is that you take us to new places through different perspectives. So, every book is different as every person reads it. Every reader reads a slightly different book.
yeah.
So, that sort of mind melt that occurs is really fascinating. It's interesting to host discussions and see that, isn't it, Patrick, where you see that, people have read the same book, but at the same time, they've also each read a unique book. Fascinating.
With my own discussion group, it's often like, I feel like Custer at the Battle of the Little Bighorn, because I'm all enthusiastic about this book and everyone hates it. They'll turn on me and stuff. That happens a lot. But it makes for a good discussion, if there are people who really dislike it and then people that really like it. If everybody likes it, it's not very interesting discussion.
Yeah.
Very true. Are there any other questions there, Patrick, or comments?
I don't really see anything. No.
Well,
On the last point, I found when I started doing book events, in fact, poison pen events, that one of the really gratifying things is that people will come up to you and they feel this intimacy in having read the book, that you too are the only people who really read this book. And then it goes to the next stage, which is that they are the only person who really knows about this book, and they start correcting you. It's really wonderful. You kind of take ownership. That's the kind of reader I appreciate. It's great.
Yeah. Yeah. that's
It
wonderful.
can be astounding. I remember how amazed I was. We did an event for Jim Butcher, who is a science fiction sort of guy, and is a real cult following. And he didn't even want me to introduce him. He has a pack store. He's sitting up in front. His publicist is over here. I've said a few words, and I'm waiting for him to start talking about his book. And what he said was, "I'll take questions." And I thought, there is no way that this is going to work. And I want to tell you what, an hour and 20 minutes later, they were still lobbing questions. But the part that was so frightening was that no matter how obscure the question or how difficult the point, whatever, everyone there knew it. It was just, I've never seen that kind. Remember that, Patrick?
I do.
I was just completely flabbergasted by it. I thought there's no way all of these people are going to be in sync. And yet they were. So he succeeded, obviously, in creating, of course, it's a fictional world anyway, it's Harry Dresden the Wizard. He succeeded in creating a world in which all of his readers were so deeply absorbed that they could follow minutia as well as big theories. It was astonishing.
Joe, I wonder if you've ever had the experience of, some reader has a question about a book that you may have written 12, 15 years ago, but they have just read it. And so they're full of all of these detailed questions about characters. And you basically have to, you're kind of thinking like, oh God, this is like being at a family reunion and trying to talk to an uncle you haven't seen in 20 years. And you're trying to recall all these things about this family that you left behind maybe a dozen years ago. And it's really kind of embarrassing because you feel like at that moment, that reader really does know these people better than you still do. So.
This happens all the time. I mean, I blush to confess, I always forget the names of my characters.
Yes.
They're very meaningful to me. I love all these people, etc., but I keep forgetting their names. And I was once on a live radio show where somebody said, "Oh, and as for that Italian inspector, what was his name again?" And I just blanked.
Well, I have to tell you guys that even happens with a brand new book. I have sat down with many an author or launching their book and recognize that a question comes up and they can't remember it because they've already finished the next book by the time this book is out, and they're working on a new book. And you get this deer in the headlines. That's why Patrick and I read the books before we do any event, because we're there to backstop the author to a great degree.
Well, I always have this moment of panic before an event like this and think, what if I forget a character's name? So I write down the names of all of my major and minor characters.
I gotta say,
hand. So
yeah, Emil Grimm, what a great name, and Lothar. The names are wonderful in this book.
Yeah.
Lots of tricks to doing all this. Well, gentlemen, I certainly hope you've enjoyed spending time together. As always, it's been an incredible pleasure for us. So Joe Kanon's book, which was out in February, we did his book launch. It was called The Berlin Exchange, and we're not holding one up because we've sold out, but reordered it today. And and Dan's book, Winter Work. This is in fact your publication party, is it not?
It is. Publication day is tomorrow, but yeah, this is kicking it off.
So I should have something better than this lousy glass of water, but
Actually,
but anyway,
I
will toast you in it and say thank you so much for joining us, and good night, everybody. Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks, Joe.
For your time.
Thanks, Patrick. Thanks, Barbara.
Thank you.
Hello. We hope you're enjoying our programs and podcasts with authors. We'd like to expand them, and your help would be appreciated. Please make a donation at poisonedpenfoundation.org. 100% of the proceeds will go to help connect authors with readers in this difficult time. Thank you.